2 minutes late, but we're just going to give it just a second and see if we get anybody else that's going to join us on the Zoom. Otherwise, we're going to do, frankly, we're probably going to do an abbreviated version and a wrap up of Contract College. So if you are watching this on Facebook, I labeled this one Contract College, the last chapter. Even though it says part one, this is the last session for this first series of contract colleges that we've done. And we're going to kick off a brand new one next Thursday. So we'll see. I'm kind of excited about that. Okay, well, we're 2 minutes in. Maybe it's just us. So Drew and I are going to do this basically for the Facebook crowd. And for those of you that are going to watch this on Facebook, because I know we have, I don't know, 10, 12, sometimes 20 people that watch it, do me a favor. We're going to give you multiple links to click through here and access our stuff. And if you would be so kind to give us some feedback in a survey, because we're not going to memorialize it forever, but we're going to memorialize pretty much the Contract College in its newest carnation by next Thursday. And if you guys have any input, I'd love to incorporate that into the new materials. Otherwise, I'm just going to run with it. So what we're going to do a little bit different. It looks like Irene's joining us. So I don't know if you're going to have camera on or not, Irene, but you haven't missed anything. We're going to start with an overview. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the entire, what we now have. It's not quite 6 chapters. It's actually more like 10 chapters, but I've got them broken into 6 pieces. I'm going to go through everything that we've already done, but we've skipped a few things. So we're definitely going to be shotgunning today. It's going to be somewhat disjointed, but I think you're going to understand how this is all going to come together for our next session. I do apologize if you guys hear a little bit of background noise. Drake and I are coming back from the SpaceX launch, and we're traveling. So we're on the side. We're at a truck stop here, doing Contract College today. So anyway, I'm going to escape out of this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys. These are the screens in part 1. So this is all of the material that we have established in part 1 that you guys have already done. And it is very difficult to see on your screen. So in effect, part 1 is the listing agreement, the disclosures that go with the listing agreement, and everything associated with the listing agreement. Drake, we're going to get some noise coming in here in a minute. We need to close that door. This guy's coming in here. Sorry, guys. So there's everything associated with the listing agreement. If I scroll down, you've got a couple of additional items on here that I want to talk about. And this is kind of how we're going to set the stage for today's class. So the first one that I don't have the form on here for, but I just want to make sure you guys are aware of what we're doing, is we had not covered the modification of listing terms. I don't actually even have the form loaded, so this will be in Contract College part 2 when we start next week. It's very straightforward. I'm going to put this here, and I'm also going to put it under the addendum section. And this is just basically saying, hey, I want to modify the listing. I want to change the date. I want to change the price. If you guys choose to use the form MT, modification of listing terms, it will be here. You can also use an addendum. This is a very simple form. Quite honestly, it's one of these forms that tends to be a little redundant, not necessarily needed, but we did not cover that the first time around. So using the modification of listing terms, form MT, and yes, I realize it doesn't say that up here. Everywhere where you see these big flashing hands, we're going to edit that. This entire edit, I'm hoping to have done within the next 24 hours, and then we'll blast all this information out to you with some notes, etc. Next form that we didn't cover on the listing side, was the cancellation of listing. So again, form COL, very simple form. I don't know that we need to spend a whole heck of a lot of time of it. This is a form that you do need to use though. So if you have a seller who wants to cancel, or you want to cancel, go into Zip Forms, form COL, cancellation of listing. It's a 1-page form. It's very straightforward. It has 2 options in it. It in effect says you're canceling by mutual agreement and they agree to pay you, or you cancel by mutual agreement and they don't agree to pay you, or you are basically canceling and you're kind of disputing it. So if you run into those type of situations, we'll have more detail on these next time around, but just be prepared for that one as well. A couple other forms we have on here is, and again, this is going to appear in multiple places. The MCA, Market Condition Advisory, everybody's pretty familiar with this. Fairly straightforward, fairly simple form. This is truly an advisory I'm going to have this form in 2 places. I'm going to have it as part of the listing agreement. Actually, I'm having it in 3 places: part of the listing agreement, part of the offer package, and also part of the disclosures and advisory forms. This is, again, just that form that tells the buyer and the seller, in this case, it's the seller, that, hey, just be aware that market conditions change. You set the price, we don't set the price, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll get you more details on that one when we get it come out next time. And estimated seller's proceeds. Now, I do an entire separate class on how to fill out a net sheet. Okay. The net sheet that is part of Zip Forms, it's pretty good. It's as good as any. Zip Forms has one. The MLS has one. Many of you guys are using your escrow officer to do a HUD-1, or what we used to call a HUD-1, basically to do a final estimated closing statement for the seller. All of those are best practice. However, and even in Contract College, it takes me 2 hours to truly do an estimated seller's proceeds class. So this will be a separate deal. I wouldn't have done it in here as part of our Contract College anyway, but I am grouping this form as part of the listing package, the listing forms that I would expect all of you guys to do as part of your listing presentation. Over the last several years, I've noticed a lot of very, very good agents, and I don't use that term lightly, that actually don't fill out estimated seller's proceeds or net sheets for their seller. They're relying on escrow. Again, I don't want to say you're a bad agent if you're doing that. I just said some good agents are doing it, but you guys do need to know how to fill these forms out and do the math and calculate it out. I think, I do a whole presentation on how to do a listing with that. So again, estimated seller's proceeds is going to end up in the listing package. And I believe that's the last one that I skipped over. Okay, so I did skip over that. We had a couple of new people that jumped in. So I'm going to escape out of this and kind of bring Mehdi and Javier up to speed on what we're doing in today's session. There's something in chat here. Let's see. I really need that. Which one do you really need, Irene? The estimated seller's net sheet class? Is that what you were asking for? It seems like you just asked it a second.
Yes, I did. That's what I did. That's the one that I need. I mean, because I see some generic ones that mortgage companies have out and all that, but I just need more of the detail.
Yep. Well, I'll do a live one because we're reorganizing all this training and we're trying to do a nice video of it, make it nice and clean and pretty. And the next time around, when we start our new class next Thursday, we're going to do these in nice, easy chunks, and they're all going to be separate videos and separate components. We'll be able to point you to that. In the meantime, let me just jump out of this here real quick. In the meantime, if you come over and you go to YouTube or just do a Google and you do Lance Martin Presents, I think if I type in net sheets, let's see what pops up. Market snapshot, net sheets. Yeah, there it is right there. So this one's old. This one's from 2014. There's some newer ones in there on our YouTube channel that you can find. This one's an hour and 52 minutes on how to fill a net sheet. Quite honestly, Irene, the math didn't change from 5 years ago. The audio and the video might not be the prettiest thing, but it's the same sort of stuff. Okay, so before I move on, these links are almost done. By the end of the day tomorrow, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this out, to everybody. The links that are in the package are now going to have all of the Contract College materials. So let me show you what I've done. Some of you may have already seen this. So you're going to find this slide at the beginning and at the end of every single contract presentation we've done. And click here for all Contract College materials and presentations. When you click into that, it's going to take you to our link tree. Some of you may have already used this link tree to get to this class. So here's the link to the Contract College today. This part 1 Contract College listing agreements and related forms. That's the package that we just looked at. That's where we just spent the last 10 minutes. Part 2 is where we're going to go next. We're going to review the purchase agreement because I've added 1 or 2 slides to that. Then we've broken it out into part 2A, which is the purchase agreement addendums. It's its own separate section because we shotgunned it all over the last 2 months. And then we've got what I'm calling contract performance. for those of you that kind of struggle with, hey, should I do a notice to perform? Should I do a demand to close? Should I do a cancellation of contract? We're going to lump all of these together. Actually, we have already lumped all of these together. And there's going to be all nice in a clean little package. So when I do next month's video, those will all be together. It'll be nice and pretty. Compensation section, that's going to be part 3. We're going to go through this here in a few minutes. That's going to be things like, buyer brokers agreements and CDAs and all that sort of stuff we'll go through. Disclosures, property management forms. I've broken the property management into 2 pieces. The property management that's only related to purchase transactions. So for those of you that don't deal with landlord tenants, we're not going to spend a lot of time going through landlord tenant stuff. And then I'm breaking out a separate section, which is truly landlord tenant. There is definitely some overlap between the two, but for most of you, you're not dealing with landlord tenant. You're just dealing with a seller holdover where they're, staying over, or maybe you're selling a property where you represent the listing or the buyer, and the seller has a tenant in place and the tenant's going to stay. So we've broken that into into these 2 different sections. And then we're going to spend the balance of the rest of our day today. And for those of you that came in a little bit late, we'll probably wrap up today in, I don't know, I can't imagine we're going to go 2 hours, probably 90 minutes, maybe less, depending on, as I have some questions. And then I've taken all of those random, crazy, seldom one-off forms that we hardly ever use, or they're just one-offs, and we made those into part 6. So this link you're going to find at the beginning and at the end of every session, just to do a real quick overview for those of you that came in a little bit late. So this is what we just went through. We went through the first package. You guys have already gone through the entire listing agreement. I know it's impossible to see, but just trust me that we've already done this. And then we just went over these 4 forms that we missed. Okay. So those will all be detailed in the next time around. And I just did a real brief summary of them now. On the second one, we're going to go to what we're calling Contract College Part 2, Purchase Agreement and Related Content. And again, we've already done this. We did this 2.5 months ago. I did add a couple of new ones on here. So rather than show you through the whole thing, I'm going to go down to the very bottom. The only thing I added on the purchase agreement section is the estimated buyer's closing cost. Now I'm going to tell you, I'm going to say the exact opposite of what I just said with the estimate of seller's closing cost. I believe everybody on this call needs to know how to fill out an estimated seller's net sheet, and you need to do it efficiently, and you need to know what you're doing. Not that you don't need to be filling out an estimated buyer's cost, but I would prefer you didn't do those at all. Okay. You're going to have a relationship with your lender. That lender is going to be the professional when it comes to filling out those costs. There's way too many variables. So I'm going to give you all a pass, and I know it says backup offer addendum. Don't pay any attention to that. I just want to talk about estimated estimated buyer's costs. So make sure that you are leaning on your lender to fill out the buyer's cost. Now, you do need to know how to calculate what a point is and how to define a loan tie-in fee, or how to describe, prorated insurance or taxes. But as far as filling those out, I want you to avoid like the plague. And quite honestly, this lender by law has to give the buyer closing disclosure anyway, that basically says this is my estimate of what they're going to be. So that's the only form that we added to part 2 in the Contract College. On part 3, we went to broker's compensation. Now this is relatively new, so I'm gonna go more deep into this because there are some forms in here we've already covered and some that we haven't. So let me just pull up the presentation on this. We are missing some stuff. So when you see those little flashing hands, just know that content didn't get uploaded before today's class, but Drew and Austin and myself are working on it. And my plan is to have all this done today or tomorrow, and then we'll send out a link with everything. So, all of these are gonna have a table of contents, so you know exactly what to have. We haven't filled it out yet, but it's all gonna be there. So when you see that fix button, this is that same link I just clicked on. And we're gonna start our session. And okay, so the first one is additional agent acknowledgement. We might have covered this previously. I don't know, Drew, did you get this one loaded? Okay, you did. Okay, so keep in mind that there's an additional agent acknowledgement and there's additional broker's acknowledgement. These are 2 completely different forms, but they look very similar, and they have very, very similar meanings, and they kind of look and feel the same way. So easiest way to distinguish what you're doing is just understand that this is agent to agent, okay? You're gonna use the additional broker acknowledgement only when you're dealing with two different companies, Coldwell Banker Town and Country, and we're cooperating with, Coldwell Banker ABC or Century 21 or whatever it happens to be. So on the broker, excuse me, on the agent acknowledgement, normally this is gonna be part of the purchase agreement or the listing agreement if you're sharing, whatever it happens to be. Pretty straightforward. Address, name of the buyers, name of the sellers. It can be landlord or tenant, understand that. And on these, you only have one choice, check one box. So if more than one applies, use a separate form for each. So what they're referring to is if there's more than one agent, use a separate form for more than one agent. All right, otherwise you're going to check one of these two boxes. So multiple licensed associates working with the seller or multiple licensed associate working with the buyer. Multiple in this case is you're going to be one of them and the other agent at Coldwell Banker is going to be the other one. Okay. And again, depending upon who you're working with, buyer, seller, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. What are the real estate license names? Okay, it's Coldwell Banker, or it's the Leaper Realty Group, whatever it happens to be, and who are the agents. So, Javier might be a good example on this. Javier and Anna work together. So if Anna's truly going to be touching these transactions and working with the client and interacting, then they should use this form. And it would basically be Coldwell Banker Town and Country. I don't think, Javier, you actually use a team name. If you did, your team name would go there. And then your name would go here, your license number, Anna's name would go there, and her license number. Now, if you do operate as a team, but one of those people are not going to be involved in the transaction, you don't necessarily need to use this. You would want to use this if that other person is going to be interacting with the client. Matter of fact, you need to use this if the other person is going to be interacting with the client. If your partner in this case is behind the scenes and doesn't do anything, then frankly, this form isn't necessary. Again, this is the acknowledgement side where the client's going to sign, and very simple, they're going to sign under their whoever they are, buyer, seller, tenant, landlord, and our names and the firm name goes in here. Very simple form. I don't see anybody unmuted, so I'm going to keep on rolling. The next form is the broker's additional broker acknowledgement. I don't know if Drew had a chance to get this one loaded. Okay, so he did. Okay, so you're going to see a tremendous amount of similarities with this. Just again, understand I'm now working with a different company. So I can work with a different company on the list, which kind of interesting. If you noticed on the other form and almost all of the forms you use, the default is always the purchase agreement. In other words, if the form starts out, this is an addendum to the purchase agreement. This is one of a very few number of forms. And I'm not really sure who at CAR made that decision, but they said, well, if we're going to have two brokers working together, they must have thought the chances of them working together on a listing agreement is higher than working with a purchase agreement. So they made the default the listing agreement, but it could be listing agreement, purchase agreement, or God forbid, the dreaded buyer representation agreement and in another one. So again, what's the date of the agreement? Who are the clients? What is the property address? Listing agreement, broker one, Coldwell Banker Town and Country. Broker number two, Century 21 ABC Realty. So again, two completely separate brokerages. This first line indicates it's a listing agreement. The second line would be used if you are representing a buyer. Okay, pretty straightforward. Then this top is the same as line two. So what are we doing? It's purchase agreement or other. Again, check only one box. All right. So we have multiple brokers, Coldwell Banker Town and Country, broker one, Century 21 ABC Realty, broker two. And this is an agreement between this is an amended to the listing agreement and what the date is. Okay. Or we have multiple brokers representing the buyer. So the first one is I'm doing the seller. Second one is I'm doing the buyer. Okay. Now this is the interesting one. Item 4, check the box. Activity under the broker license of broker one or broker two or both, if applicable, will be conducted by multiple associates and partners or teams indicated in the additional agent. So what they're telling you here is you have to have an AAA, additional agent acknowledgement, and that additional agent acknowledgement is in effect going to reference back to this. So, hey, I'm Lance Martin with Coldwell Banker Town and Country. Well, who is the agent at Century 21 ABC? So that would be listed out on the additional agent acknowledgement. The only thing that's going to go here is going to be the names of the brokerage firms. Okay. Again, paragraph 5 is an acknowledgement that the parties understand what they're signing, and they sign on the bottom of the page. Okay, so we've got our additional agent acknowledgement, our additional broker acknowledgement. Again, this is a form that we skipped. So we're coming back in here and we're talking about this. If you're going to do, and again, I don't think, Drew, did you guys load this one up? I don't think you did. Okay, they didn't. Okay, so I don't actually have this form loaded up yet. It's only a 2-page form. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get this onto the next session, and we'll get the forms dialed in here, hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow. This is going to be a form that you're going to use for the most part for a like a for sale by owner. Probably the single best and probably one of the only uses I can think of in using this. So if you have a client, and again, a for sale by owner that says, hey, I'll go ahead and I'll give you an opportunity to sell my house, but I don't want to sign a long-term listing agreement. Oh, and by the way, I'll only pay you if you bring me a buyer. Who is that buyer? So this, in effect, you would go through and you would say, hey, you're going to pay me X amount of dollars as the seller. Could be the opposite. Buyers, it was different. This is generally designed for a seller to sign. And this compensation is due if I bring Sally Smith with an acceptable offer under terms that you've agreed to, and then and only Sally Smith. And then there's generally going to be there's always going to be a timeline associated with it. So they'll pay you if Sally Smith buys the house within the next 30 days. Again, a single party compensation agreement. And for those of you who need that, we'll go into these more when we get into the next contract. Okay, we've done this one. I think that might be, actually, that's not it. I'm going to keep on scrolling and we'll clean these up for you guys. Okay, cooperating broker compensation. We did discuss this form. I think, I don't know, maybe a week or two ago, but I'm going to just take a minute or two to go over it again very, very quickly. This additional, actually, I take it back. We haven't loaded it. Okay, so the form that we have here is the wrong form. So let me just go over the CBC. I think we have this in here. I'm pretty sure we did this 2-3 weeks ago, but let me just take a moment. So this is the deal. The the cooperating broker compensation form is a form that's used a lot and quite honestly is not needed. Okay, it drives me crazy. And what I mean by, let me get out of this. I can bring this up, make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see what I'm talking about. I know this isn't ideal. We're doing such a good job trying to make everything pretty, and now I'm making it really ugly. But on this form, in effect, what we're referring to is who's the broker, what's the property address, what's the address, who's the buyer's brokerage firm. So Coldwell Banker is a listing broker representing the seller, the buyer's broker, Century 21 ABC Realty. And in effect, that agent at ABC Coldwell or Century 21 ABC Realty wants to make sure, they want to confirm the compensation that's going to be paid on that transaction. When I say this generally isn't necessary, because more times than not, what I see is I see a listing that says I'm offering a 3% compensation to the selling office. Okay. And then I see a confirmation of compensation form that says, oh, it's going to be a 3% compensation to the selling office. If there's no change to it, guys, you don't need to do the form. Okay. And quite honestly, if you do want to make a change to it, you're not supposed to make a change to it. If the MLS says I'm offering a 3% compensation to the selling office, the rules of the MLS say, if that's what they offer, that's what you accept. We do not negotiate that back and forth. Now, I know that it does get negotiated periodically, but it's not supposed to be. So this would not be the place to negotiate the compensation. Now, if there was some sort of a modification of the compensation in the MLS, this is where you would put it. So if it said it was going to be X and for some reason something changed and you and the other broker agreed, okay, it's going to be different than what's in the MLS, then you would put it here. And then quite honestly, this form would be completely appropriate. You would want to use the confirmation of compensation form. And I know we just talked about this. So for those of you guys who are on the class, I apologize. I just wanted to kind of cover this because it went with the compensation with the other ones. And then brokers that are not part of the MLS. So if you have a broker that's outside the MLS, they're not a CRMLS member. You may not understand, but the rules that govern how we get paid are governed through CRMLS. So if you have a realtor excuse me, probably wouldn't be a realtor. They'd be a real estate licensee, but not a realtor because they're probably not a member of an association, which makes them a realtor. And they're therefore not a member of the MLS. So they're duly licensed. Their license is just as good as yours and ours, but since they're not a member of the MLS, they're not bound to the rules of the MLS. Another reason why this form would be used, you would put the compensation in here. And then if it's a short sale, this in effect says, and we talked about this in a different capacity on the short sales, is if the bank on the short sale modifies the compensation, then everybody understands that whatever that modification is going to need to be readdressed between the buyer's broker and the listing broker. Properties that are not in the MLS, again, same thing. I'm writing an offer. It's not even in the MLS. And what are the terms going to be? And then sales to tenants. You know, we do property management all the time. Normally those properties don't go in the MLS. This landlord comes to us, they want to sell it. We go to the tenant. Every now and then the tenant says, yes, I want to buy it. Okay, well, in that case, we would want to confirm what the compensation is. Basic instruction to the broker or the escrow holder. This is how much we're going to pay. Just in a normal CDC is going to be requested as well. And then management approval. This is the same exact language that's in the listing agreement. Every time you guys take a listing agreement, you may not be aware of it, but there's a section in there that says, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, these price and terms are subject to management approval. If the broker doesn't like it or the manager doesn't like it, we don't have to agree to it. I don't know that we've ever done that. But anyway, so that is the compensation form. So let me go back here. Now, someone help me out on this. This is that new form, that buyer's representation and broker compensation agreement. Did we go through this? Because this one's going to take a little bit longer. Did we go through this several weeks ago? Does anybody have a memory on this? I don't mind doing it. I think we do have the documents here.
I don't think we did it. I don't remember.
Okay, all right, then let's do it. I'm going to say let's do it, assuming I actually have the documentation here. If I not, we're going to be okay. So we do. Okay, so here we go, guys. This is basically the new version of the buyer's broker's agreement. So this is the buyer's broker agreement that was modified back in December of last year. There's a couple other forms that have come out in anticipation. By the way, if looks like I'm hot and sweaty, I am hot and sweaty. We're in Texas and the humidity is 100% here. Our air conditioning is a little bit rough, but I'm gonna power through. So, so this would be the form that you guys would use if there's no compensation being offered on the listing side. And ultimately, if some of these lawsuits are successful, and it's going to change a lot of things for us if some of these lawsuits are successful. So it's entirely, I don't believe this is going to happen, but if some of these lawsuits are successful sometime in the next 2-3 years, we all may be using these buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. So what do we have here? Basically what we have here, this is going to be between the brokerage and the buyer. Okay. And so representation period and right to represent. Think of this as a listing agreement between you and the buyer. It's got very, very similar terms and language in it. So if we remove the word seller for buyer, you're going to kind of flow with me on this. So Sally Smith is our buyer, is Grant & Coldwell Banker Town & Country the broker, beginning on today's date and ending in 90 days at 12. Again, just like an expiration on a listing, same type of thing. The Sally Smith is saying, I don't have any pre-existing compensation agreements. Just like with a listing, we don't want to list somebody's house only to find out they have 2 other listings with 2 other companies. So we want to make sure we understand that this is in effect an exclusive buyer's broker's agreement for 2 reasons. We don't want Sally running around working with other people. And number 2, we don't want Sally running around committed to pay other people commissions with money that she doesn't have. That doesn't do anybody any good. So you have a couple of options here on paragraph 3. So we can come up here and say, well, what are we doing? Well, the location, Southern California, the city of Riverside, San Bernardino, Marietta, Temecula, and Claremont, whatever it happens to be. Or you could say the counties of LA, Riverside, San Bernardino, Orange. I want to cover everything in Southern California. Or it can be a price range. Doesn't matter where Sally buys, anything that she buys between $100,000 and $2 million, boom, it's covered. Or you can get a little bit more specific, okay? Or you can say the following specified properties only. So now again, you would think it would be an address, which it could be. You could say, she's only going to pay me if I buy 123 Main Street. But it also could be something as simple as a single family house or a condominium or a strip center, whatever it happens to be. So you can be a little bit more vague. So either way with that, I think is perfectly fine. Hopefully my form is formatted. I have the C over, I do, okay. Or properties identified on the attached list. So going back a page, if you did put, one or two properties here and you could get it to fit, so be it. But let's suppose there was 32 properties. Well, then you would check box C. You would give a list and away you go. So what's the compensation going to be? Very similar to a listing agreement. I'm going to pay 3% of the acquisition price. Acquisition, of course, ultimately the contract price. And it doesn't say or, and, okay, so it could be, I'm going to pay 3% of the acquisition price and $5,000. I don't know, get creative there. Or maybe this is going to be a flat fee, $22,000. That's what she's going to pay. Or pursuant to the compensation schedule attached. So in theory, you could get creative with this and you can say, well, if I do this type of property, I'm going to get paid this. If it's a different type of property, I'm going to pay this. If it's a different price range, I could pay that. Sky's the limit. Could be a little nutty though. Okay. Broker right to compensation. This just basically says if we perform within the specified time frame, this is what you're going to owe us. Pretty straightforward. Broker involvement. So this is interesting. This basically defines what the broker's involvement is in the property. So it's telling the buyer. Broker involvement means the following. Buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker. I think that's an easy one, right? I showed you the house. Okay. Broker showed the property to the buyer virtually. I didn't take you to the property, but I did something on my phone, or I sent you a link with a link to the property, virtual tour. Broker submitted to seller a signed written form to acquire, lease, exchange, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's a very interesting one though. So let's suppose you never showed the property. You never even did anything virtual, but at some point in time, the buyer said, well, I'm going to trust you to write the offer. If you trust me to write the offer, whether I showed it to you or not, okay, then that's considered involvement. Okay, property was introduced to the buyer. And back to now again, however, merely sending a list of properties shall not be deemed the broker involvement without documentation of action. So this is what we're good at, right? We're working with the buyer, I send a list, I say, this is my list, and there's really no other involvement. The buyer takes that list, runs out, looks at the house, maybe it's an open house, but you've done nothing else. And the buyer says at that point, well, geez, all he did is send me a list. That's no big deal. I could have got this list myself. I mean, I could have gone on to Zillow and said, I told him the type of property I was looking for. So this is kind of where this procuring cause issue is going to come into play. So it'll be very interesting to see how this shakes out. I think generally speaking, we haven't had any of these problems in a while, but they will become problems. I guarantee you it will become a problem. Then you're going to hear a lot more about procuring cause. Buyer acquisition, exclusive representation. This agreement shall be exclusive and irrevocable. Okay. Broker will devote time, resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in effect saying this is an exclusive representation. A broker is entitled to compensation. If you purchase a property under the terms and listed above, you got to pay me. Okay. Cancellation. Either the buyer or broker can cancel if given written notice. And upon receipt of the notice, it's upon receipt, or you can say, no, I've got a certain number of days. But 30 days after. So this is one of those things, if I sit back and say, I'm working with Drake and I give him a list of properties and he decides to cancel, and there's, okay, great. We're going to get 30 days and he goes out and buys one of those properties on my list that I showed him and all the rest of that, then I'm entitled to compensation. Very similar to what we used to call procuring cause all the time. And in theory, you could get in a fight with another broker because, hey, I did show the property. I was involved in this transaction, and then the buyer decided to snake me out. I will tell you guys though, if you run into that situation, probably the default position for Coldwell Banker Town and Country is going to be a simple one, and it's going to be buyer chooses. Okay. Now that's not exactly what this contract says, but that's the approach generally that I take on these things, where if the buyer doesn't want to work with you and they chose to write an offer with somebody else, what are we going to do? We're going to go to war with them. If ultimately that's what happened, then unfortunately, you got to take a look in the mirror and say, okay, why is this happening? Why did this buyer not want to work with me when I spent all this time with him? Having said that, if you did check the boxes in effect and saying, going back to involvement, broker involvement, if you truly can say, yes, I was involved, and the buyer skates you on that, well, we're in theory entitled to a commission. Accounting for payments to brokers by other brokers. Let's take a minute on this. Accounting for payments to brokers by others. So what this is talking about, and this is the part that gets misunderstood. So let's suppose Drake is my buyer and he agrees to pay me 3% of the purchase price. But I write an offer for him on a house where the listing agent and the seller of that house also has agreed to pay me a 3% compensation if I represent a buyer. Well, Drake agreed to pay me 3. I'm already getting 3. Drake doesn't have to pay me anything. That's basically how this works. If there's a difference, Drake would pay the difference. All right. So it's very important that you guys understand that. And when we get into that part of the RPA, which looks like it's going to become commonplace, it's just super important that you guys understand how the math works. Pretty simple though. I don't know that it's really complicated when you kind of sit back and think about it. It makes sense. Authorization to conclude commissions in the offer. So the buyer authorizes by default the broker to include the terms of the buyer or does not include that. So this is something that the buyer needs to authorize. Hey, if Drake authorized to pay me 2% commission or 3% or 4%, whatever it happens to be, by default, we want the seller to know that. Everybody needs to see that this is transparent so we know who's paying who and how this is going to get sorted out. So that's just a continuation of the last page we just did. Additional broker right for compensation. Again, this says fixed. This is don't worry about the oops, sorry, let me get rid of that. So additional broker compensation. So what they're referring to is the broker shall be entitled to compensation as of whatever it is in paragraph 4 within however many days. Generally speaking, I think most of us are probably I'm going to recommend a default for 30 to 60 days after that period of time. So it's the example I just gave is if Drake goes out and buys a house within 30 days after cancellation on a property that I had involvement on, he's going to owe me some compensation. I think we might be, Drew, did we not finish uploading the rest of this form?
Yeah, well, this was a bad one to go. I should have told you. I stepped away for a second, but the next one should be good. We just didn't have all the pages loaded.
Okay. All right, guys. So again, we're basically in cleanup mode here. So I apologize for that. We're pulling in some forms at the very end of our contract college that got overlooked or was in the wrong order. So we'll get through the rest of that, and it'll be in the next contract college. That's our bad.
I have a question.
Sure. Go ahead.
I have a regarding what you're just talking about on the last form about canceling out with a buyer canceling out.
Yep.
Do you? I kind of hear mixed ideas or mixed recommendations on whether even to have a buyer that you're working with even sign one, because if they don't want to work with you after a while, don't work with it. So, I mean, I did have one that, you know, after 4 months of going through hoops and showing houses and all that stuff at the beginning of the year, he just says, oh, we're going to go with somebody else. And, you know, I followed every single step, you know, et cetera, whatever the story may be.
But did they
I didn't
sign a buyer's representation agreement? Probably not.
No,
Right.
that's what yeah. And I get it. I'm just saying, do you recommend it?
Well, this is the
Do
deal.
you not?
This is the deal. I don't run. Number one, I generally don't recommend these. I think they're a waste of time. I think you're going to have a very difficult time getting your buyers to sign these. They're not very well understood by the buyers. They're certainly not very well understood by the agents. But there's a big caveat here. It's entirely possible, whether I think this is a good idea or not, we're going to be in this situation because this is where the legislation or these lawsuits appear to be pushing us. So for right now, there's nothing wrong with getting them to sign it. If you can get a buyer to sign it, fantastic. You know, now you've got them kind of locked in, so to speak. But the reality is this is not a common practice form in today's real estate transaction. It's entirely possible it's going to change here in the next year or two, which is why we're spending so much time on it now. But under your situation, Irene, You're working with the buyer like 99% of the other agents out there. You're working hard. You got time, energy, effort, money put into them. And then for whatever reason, they just choose to write an offer with somebody else, or all of a sudden they ghost you. And then 3 months later, they write an offer with somebody else. They chose somebody else. I mean, that's at the end of the day, they just chose somebody else and they didn't choose you. And could you have a procuring cause if you showed them that property and you did all these sort of things? You could. Is it something that I would recommend you even attempt to pursue? I would not.
Right. I get that. I understand. I just wanted to know if you would recommend even doing that because, you know, like I said, I followed everything, went through the price range that the guy wanted, and I kept trying to, and I was trying to tell him or explain to him where the money where he wants to spend is not going to buy him a property where he wants to live.
Yep.
And he ended up buying somewhere else and
Yeah.
40,000 more. So,
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, whatever, you know, it's
Well,
almost like,
it's super frustrating, but let's pretend, let's fast forward and let's just pretend 2 years from now that this form is in commonplace use and we're using it on all, if not most of our transactions. And your buyer, same exact situation, your buyer signed this form, and let's just for argument's sake, say they signed it and they went ahead and they worked for somebody else and they're in 100% breach of contract on this form. I will tell you, it's going to be very interesting to see how many of these Coldwell Banker Town and Country pursue legally. And I don't know the answer. I'm not going to prejudge it, but I can tell you, I'm not going to be looking forward to pursuing buyers in small claims court or superior court for commission disputes. And I'll just use a different example. I can count on one hand, probably can count on 2 fingers, the number of sellers that we actually have pursued in court to basically, demand compensation, listing commissions that we were entitled to. And we took it that far. Matter of fact, I think the reality, the answer is 1. And it's just not something that we generally do. But we shall see, but under your situation, you're out of luck. The buyer chose and they didn't choose you. Under this situation, if they chose somebody else and you check the boxes, they could be responsible for commission, and in theory, we could sue them.
yeah, I just think that me personally, I would just think it'd be a waste of time to address that.
Yep, and I agree. Time to move on. Time to move on to the next. But again, this is going to come up, whether it's with our brokerage or with another. So we'll get the balance of that form plugged in, and when we do our new contract college, this is the form that is currently in the contract. It's on page 2 or on page 3, and the buyer's agents are starting to check this. This is the SPBB. We've talked about this a couple of times in a sales meeting. And again, if this lawsuit ultimately is successful, then this form is going to become used regularly. And we talked about it briefly. It's only a 1-page document, so it's pretty easy to go through. And what this one is, this is basically saying that the seller is asking the buyer to pay, the buyer, scratch that. This is acknowledging how much money the seller is agreeing to pay the buyer's broker. Why is that important? Because maybe the buyers have agreed to pay the buyer's broker. The example I just gave you, the buyer's already agreed to pay, Drake has already agreed to pay me a 3% commission. Why is it important that the buyer know how much the seller is agreeing to pay me? Because if it's a 3% commission, then the buyer doesn't have to pay me anything. So that's the whole purpose of this form SPBB that's currently in the contract. This showed up in the contract in December. So what do we have here? We've got the purchase agreement with the date, property address, buyer and seller. Buyer has entered into a written agreement to compensate the buyer's broker. So this is Drake has entered into an agreement to compensate me 3% or whatever the dollar amount is. As of the date of this, the seller's payment to the buyer's broker is documented. And that is how much? It's 3%. So if they're both the same, then Drake doesn't have to pay me anything. Okay, same example I just gave. If there's a variance, then it's going to be whatever the variance is. Seller agrees to pay the buyer's broker X, blah, 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 or check the box, insert an amount or an amount which is no greater than the applicable percentage. Okay. Buyer authorizes escrow holder upon request to deliver seller a copy of the written agreement. and basically at the end of the day pays the difference. Apply the offset, which is what paragraph 4 and 5 talk about. So we've already covered this in the prior form. So this is the form that's in the contract currently. I've told you guys already, do not use this form until we tell you to start using it. Right now, who knows? I don't know if it's a year away, 2 years away, or 6 months away, but there it is. Okay, I think we're getting close. Let me escape out of this. Okay, so this is another one. Did we put this in here? Oh, it looks like we did. It looks like we did. Okay, so let's jump in here. Anticipated broker. Now, this is a form we also talked about at the sales meeting briefly. We'll take a little bit more time to go through it. So this is the form ABCD. Now, what this form does, it basically, this is a form between the buyer's broker, okay, and the buyer. And it in effect says, these are the properties that I'm showing you, and this is what the commission is outlined on those. This is not required today. If we get to the point, this would be required, and you guys are going to be responsible to disclose the commission due on every single property, or excuse me, the commission offered on every single property that you're going to show that buyer. That's what that form's all about. They sign it and away they go. And it will be required. That's part of the deal. And I believe, okay, so that's it. So we added those extra forms under the compensation section. So we'll get those cleaned up and make them nice and pretty so that you guys have that. This is the exact same link that I showed you guys before that has the link to all those materials. So that's part 3. Let's jump into part 4. Part 4, I've now called disclosures and advisories. We've already gone through 95% of the forms on this template. I did add a few more, so let's go through on the ones that I've added. Let's review them very quickly. Again, I'm just looking for my little yellow hand to tell me which one I added. Okay, so we added the wildfire addendum. I think we actually covered, let me pull this up. Okay, this is the wildfire disaster advisory form. I think we covered this previously, but I want to go through it quickly because I didn't have it on my thing. So if someone says, yeah, Lance, we already did it, then so be it. Hopefully we guys, okay, so the team has loaded this up for me. Great. So we're going to basically be using this form. It was revised last year. It is exactly what it indicates. There's been a wildfire. There has been a disaster. This property is in an area that's been impacted by that. Pretty straightforward. Okay. Actually, you know, I'm not going to go through this form. We talked about this last week. So I've already done this one. So let's skip through wildfire advisory. The hardening. Drew, did you guys get the hardening form in here for me? It doesn't look like it.
Austin was working on this one, but I think he got it.
Okay, well, I don't see it here. So let me just pull this up so you guys can see what we're looking at. So this is the hardening form. We've done previous training classes on these. I'll bring this early up into next year, next time contract college. This is basically the form that says, hey, I am in a high fire zone. Therefore, I have to use the fire hardening form, which is actually an addendum to the contract. It's not just a disclosure, it's an addendum to the contract. And this is where the buyer, the seller has to have the local fire ordinance go out. The county needs to go out and inspect the property to make sure we don't have wood shingles, or we don't have firewood stacked up against the house and all the rest of that. So we will add this form into our next contract college class. We've gone through this previously. I do want to obviously incorporate it into our class to make sure we've got that covered. The RC, I don't believe we did this, so I'm going to take a minute on this because this is an important one, and it seems, I guess it appears based on my recollection, we skipped over this. This is the representative capacity. This can be extremely confusing. So I want to take a minute just to make sure you guys understand where we are with the representative capacity signature disclosure. Okay. So first of all, it's not an assignment. All that this says is that the buyer has some other entity, or the entity has some other individual who's going to be signing for them. So this will be used on a probate, be used on a trust, could be used on corporate documents, whatever it happens to be. So let's just suppose we have a trust that we're doing here. Okay. So the trust is the Lance Martin Family Trust, and Lance Martin is dead. All right. So Drake is my trustee, or Drew is the co-trustee, whatever it happens to be. So they are the seller's representatives, and they are acting in a certain capacity on behalf of the Lance Martin Trust. All right. So the purpose of the form supersedes any legal signer's representation. So this form says, hey, it doesn't matter if it's someone signed that for the Martin Trust. We now know who the proper representatives are, and they're going to be the people outlined in here. So this is a disclosure to the purchase agreement, could be the listing agreement as well. What's the date? What's the property address? Who's the buyer? Who's the seller? Now, here we go here. Buyer and seller are referred to as the parties. If a trust and the blank line above identify the seller as trustee of the trust, or just the simple name of the trust, the John Doe trustee or the John Doe trust. This is where in the past we'd go crazy because it would have a super long name on the trust and it didn't fit into zip forms, or maybe we didn't exactly know what it was. So maybe the Lance Martin Trust isn't just the Lance Martin Trust. Maybe the official name of the trust is the Lance Martin Trust, dated January 5th, 1992. Okay, and that the date and is part of the trust name. You don't have to worry about that. Okay, so you could just put in the Lance Martin Trust, or you could even put in the Martin Trust. Okay, we'll clean that up later on in the form, so you don't have to get too crazy with that. So if it's a trust, sure, property sold. Now this is where we want the full name of the trust, because sometimes it's super long. It wouldn't fit in the prior thing. So this is where I could put in this gigantic name of the trust. This is kind of ironic because the example I just gave you can be really confusing. You guys, there are a lot of trusts out there that the date of the trust is incorporated in the legal name of the trust. So in the example I just gave you, the Lance Martin Trust dated March 10th, 2019 or whatever, that's the entire name. So you would type that in here, dated 2019, and then you would type the date in here again, dated, July 10th, 2019. So it's just one of those things, the way the attorneys have set these up. The person signing below is or are sole or co-successor trustees of the trust. So again, if it's an individual, they're the sole. If it's a co, then it's a co. What is the entity? Is it a corporation with an liability, or is it a partnership? Which, by the way, there's two separate things. Actually, we have four separate things. A trust, it's the example I just gave you. Well, what if it's a corporation? Well, it's not a trust. Okay, so the entity, generally when you talk entity, you're talking about some sort of a corporate type thing, limited liability corporation, partnership, corporation. Those are not trusts. Trusts are set up for individuals. Entities are set up generally for corporations. Could be a power of attorney. Lance isn't dead. Okay, I'm alive, but I'm going to be incapacitated for 6 months. I'm in major surgery and I'm not going to be available. So I'm going to sign a power of attorney. Okay, same type of rules apply. Who is my power of attorney? Which, by the way, we do these periodically. I'm not a fan of power of attorney. So whenever you guys have a client who's saying, hey, I have power of attorney for mom or dad. I mean, we do them all the time and there's nothing illegal about them, but I always tend to get a little more nervous. Power of attorneys tend to be looked at a little heavier by the title companies and such. So just make sure everybody's got their ducks in a row and their stories are lining up, because I'm going to probably have a few questions just to make sure that their stories are lining up. And if it is a power of attorney, attorney must have already been executed before this form is used. Excuse me, I skipped a line. This form is not a power of attorney. Okay, a power of attorney must already been executed. So this form does not serve as a power of attorney. They already have to have a power of attorney. So they just can't say, oh yeah, I'm going to be mom and dad's power of attorney, and let me sign this form and away you go. No. They have to already have a power of attorney that's already been established. And then is it an estate? Yeah, sure. So it's an estate, it's a conservatorship, it's a guardianship. I've got, guardians for minor children, whatever it happens to be. Those are always going to have some sort of court case associated with it. Okay. So when you've got that and say, hey, I'm a conservator for my mom, great. Who appointed you conservator? Great. Riverside County family law judge did. Here's the name of the case and here's the number of the case. Pretty straightforward stuff. So you identify that, and then in effect they're going to sign. So if it's Drake, Drake is going to sign as the trustee, or if he's the officer of the corporation, he's going to sign as the officer of the corporation, or the managing member. That's interesting because all those hedge fund properties that we closed a few years ago, they had a partner agreement and an operating agreement. And if I'm not mistaken, they referred to the authorized signer as the managing member. That was their title for that entity, or the partner, attorney in fact, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, pretty straightforward stuff. It tends to get confusing. Anybody have any questions? I don't see anybody unmuted. Okay,
No need for this form if it's checked on the contract, correct, Lance?
say that again, Javier.
There's no need for RCSD if it's checked on the contract, correct?
What do you mean if it's checked on the contract? If it's checked on the contract, you do need the form. If it's not checked on the contract, you don't. But you should be using this form. You don't have to. This form's relatively new. You don't have to use this form, but you should be using this form. Now, having said, I'm not sure I'm answering your question. Let me give you this answer then, and maybe it'll give you what you're looking for. If I write out, like we've done for my entire real estate career, the Lance Martin Living Trust, and then let's suppose Drake is my representative, and Drake signs Drake Martin, trustee for the Lance Martin Living Trust, and they write that into the contract, then you don't need this form. That's what
I'm sorry, I didn't ask the question right. On the contract, there's a page there where an entity will sign or accept the offer. And it says that there's no need for this form. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm drawing blank on the specific paragraph that you're referring to.
Me
But
too.
this form is more for clarity. So this is the deal. If it's very clear in the RPA who the authorized signer is and what the
Yes,
then you don't need the form. No,
yeah, that's what I meant.
yeah, then
that's
you
what
don't
I
need
meant.
it. Where this really becomes more,
Right.
I think the genesis of this, and I may be wrong, but I think the genesis of this form is that there's so many trusts and there's so many corporate entities that have these ridiculously long names. Okay. And we just couldn't fit them into the RPA. They just physically didn't fit. That's where I believe that's where this form has come from. Now, having said that, I do really like, let me go back. I really like this section because it's very clear on exactly who this is their trust, is any power of attorney, is the state. So that also can get a little bit muddy. But the short answer to your question, Javier, is if it's clear on the contract, you don't need the form. Okay, I just did one of these. I didn't really do it, but I had this conversation with Darlene, and her client doesn't want to do these. Her client says, "This is how I do it." And I looked at it, says, "Darlene, it's perfectly clear who the entity is. It's perfectly clear who the signer is. Fine, we don't have to do the form. No problem."
Correct. Thank you.
Okay. So let's keep on moving here. I think that might be. Let me escape out of this. Okay, so we're done. So I added those forms to the disclosure and advisory. So we're going to clean this up, and then this will be all nice and pretty order. So that was part 4. Part 5, I don't think we're going to go through it all. Part 5 was the seller holdover on the property management forms. We spent a lot of time and we went through the property management forms that the seller is required when they're doing a holdover. So we already did these, but they're now nice and grouped a little prettier. Now, I will tell you, there are a couple of forms I'm going to add to this. For example, there's a mold ventilation form, which we did not discuss, and I don't believe it's in here. So when we do round 2 of contract college starting next week, will it be updated? Sure. Will there be an extra form in here? Yes. I will add a mold ventilation form into this particular section. So we've already covered the forms in this section. Now, for those of you that are doing a lot of property management, and I mean true property management, where you're not doing buyer seller type stuff, where this is landlord tenant only. We've covered a few of these forms in this class, but the reality is, for me to truly do justice on the property management landlord tenant section, we'll probably add an extra 7-8 hours to this class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do these kind of offline, because I don't want to, actually, I'm not going to do them offline. I'll let you guys know when I'm going to do them so that you can kind of participate. But what I do want to keep our focus mostly on residential real estate sales transactions. And I don't want to add, 3 weeks of contract college because of property management stuff. However, all of these forms will be available to you. we are going to do them in the form of a video and we're going to clean them up. So if you guys want to go in and say, well, geez, I'm going to do my very first landlord tenant lease, and I want to brush up on it, in the same way I just referred Irene over to a YouTube video, whatever it happens to be, I'll be able to refer you guys over to the property management section. So that is Contract College Part 5, landlord tenant only. Okay, and we're believe it or not, guys, I think we're actually going to get out here a little bit early because I'm on the very last section and I'm calling that Contract College Part 6. Where did it go? Part 6. Okay, now these are the seldom one-off forms. Now, again, I still got a little bit of cleanup to do on this, but I'm committed to finishing Contract College today. So these are going to be a little bit uglier than I'd like them to be, but they should all be pretty here by the end of the day tomorrow. And then you guys can go back and take a look at these. Real quick before I get into the rest of this, because I almost forgot. On this form here, in addition to having the documents, the canvas that you have been looking at for the last hour, we're going to now have also all of the PDFs for these in the proper order. Previously, we were just giving you PDFs and it didn't make any sense because they didn't correspond to everything. So part 1 will have its own set of PDFs in the proper order. Part 2, its own set of PDFs in the proper order. And I think it'll be a lot easier for you guys to manage. You know, when I was teaching Contract College for Norm, we had 3 different sets of PDFs. Each one of those PDFs, I think, were 250 pages each. So we had about 750 pages of documents, and they were just big chunks of documents. We're going to keep these in sections. So that'll be hopefully available to you. My goal is by the end of the day tomorrow. Okay, so let's go through this. We went through the notice of non-responsibility. I told you guys last week I was going to get you an example. I don't know that I did get you a good example, so I'm going to skip past that one right now. This is one of those seldom used forms. I didn't even know where to start with it. Homeowners Association request. We went through this last week. Okay, so again, if you're doing an HOA, you want to basically use these documents and also use these as much as for a reminder than anything else. You can go through, for example, and just say, hey, did I get a copy of the CCNRs? Did I get a copy of the bylaws? Did I get a copy of the budget? So I like to see these forms more as just kind of a mental checklist to you than anything else. So so we did go through these. It was either last week or the week before. So I'm going to go ahead and chunk on past this one. And as you can tell, we're still got a little bit of work in process. This is the information request. We went through this one last week on the HOA as well. So this is the document that you would basically send to the HOA and say, I need this stuff back. So we went through that. And let's see what we got going on here. Key safe. I don't know if did you guys get this one loaded from it? Oh, you did. Okay, so this is generally speaking, I want to see these on every single property that you are putting a lockbox on. Okay, this is referenced in the listing agreement. If you're putting a lockbox on, or if you think you're going to put a lockbox on, make sure that your seller is signing and executing the key safe lockbox addendum. Very straightforward. It just explains what the lock boxes are, explains how they work, it explains who has access to them. And then of course it has the caveats on here as far as, you know, don't cancel your insurance, don't leave your jewelry out, don't do silly things. Okay. You know, I've never had a problem, ever had a problem with anybody using a lockbox to steal anything or go into someone's medicine cabinets and steal their drugs or whatever it happens to be. But pretty straightforward stuff. Just make sure you use it. There is a tenant section in here. Okay. I do not recommend that you put lockboxes on tenant occupied properties, even with the tenant's permission. It's one thing for the owner to give you permission. Something gets stolen from the owner's, you know, dresser or whatever it happens to be, or they think there's been some unauthorized access. I'm much more comfortable dealing with that by the person who actually owns the property. I am not comfortable dealing with that with the tenant. I'm much more protective or concerned with the tenant's rights and their ability to come back and cause me trouble. Now, if you're like, well, Lance, but I need to get in here and the tenant agreed and the broker insists or the owner insists, okay, fine. I'm just telling you, you're asking for trouble. Or you could be asking for trouble. So I do not recommend you put any lock boxes on tenant occupied properties with or without their permission. And this is page one, and they obviously signed above that. So that's our key safe. And I believe, I may be wrong, I believe that's by default in the listing agreement. This will go back into the listing agreement section. I believe the default selection in the listing agreement is that they do agree to put a lockbox on. They would have to go in and say, no, I don't want to put a lockbox on. I don't know if they uploaded this one. Let's see if they did. And then this is the photo release. Okay, they did. Okay, so basically, if you have any images that the seller is providing you to use for their listing, or if you are using photos on their property and there's any concern as to who owns those properties, and you want to basically get this you want to get this executed. You basically want to make sure you have the rights to use those photographs from the owner of those photographs. That could be the seller of the property may have that. This may get signed by the photographer. The photographer may own those. Then it talks about, again, do I have the consent to have a picture, which, by the way, you should never put any photos. By the way, it's against the MLS rules to put photos of people in the MLS. All right. But God forbid you did get a photo during a photo shoot of the seller, or God forbid their kid. You don't want that. You want to get rid of those photos immediately. Certainly want to get rid of them of minors. Same thing with pets. Don't take pictures of pets, and ideally try to stay away from photos of personal property. They've got a $100,000 painting on the wall kind of a thing. So again, just very simple, straightforward. I don't think there's anything too crazy about this form. Just make sure that they understand if you're using those photos that you get that release signed. I don't see anybody unmuted, so I'm going to keep on rolling. The SELM, it doesn't look like they loaded this. Oh, they did. Okay. So I hate this form. And the reason I hate this form is because I do not want you guys excluding listings from the MLS under most circumstances. There are some circumstances where using the SELM is perfectly fine. I would suggest that those circumstances are few and far between, but this is generally the pocket listing form. Okay. I've taken a listing. I don't want to put it in the MLS. I'm not going to put it in the MLS. And why do I not want to do that? Previously, the reason was, well, I don't want to do it because it's a great listing and I'm going to double end it myself. And I'm just going to hold the open house this weekend. Sounds great. Yes, potentially give me more compensation coming into you in the office. Yes, that's a wonderful thing. However, if it's not in your seller's best interest, then you're in breach of your fiduciary duty. And it's in your interest, not the seller's interest. There's an entire section, I think it's in the entire page 2 of the listing agreement that didn't even exist several years ago. And the only reason it exists is because listing agents did bad things. They were bad actors, and they were doing everything they could to double end a property to their advantage, as opposed to their seller's advantage. Now, if you have a circumstance where it makes sense, and I'll give you an example. I'm not even sure this is the best example. The seller, you already have a buyer. The seller is maybe ill or elderly, has health issues, doesn't want to show the property. There's just a million reasons why they just don't want to do it. It's not convenient for them. But you have a buyer who's at market price, and you can come to them and say, this is the deal. We can do this and we can get you out of here, and you don't have to show it. I know you're going through chemotherapy and blah, 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 all of those things. But if it's truly in the seller's best interest, and you can look yourself in the eye, and more importantly, look a mediator or an arbitrator or a judge in the eye and say, well, yes, this was in the seller's best interest, and that's why we did it this way, then fine. Then let's do that. Let's make sure we talk about it. If you can't use that high of a standard, put the thing in the MLS and be done with it. So what does this form basically say? It says exactly what the title says. The seller is instructing you to exclude the property from the MLS. Okay. It said you don't have to put it in the MLS. So it's an addendum to listing agreement, the property address, who's the seller, who's the broker. I'm in CRMLS. And now this goes through and says, well, the title of the form says you don't want it in the MLS, but we're going to tell you why you should put it in the MLS. So let's give you the benefits of using the MLS. Yes, it gets exposure, blah, 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 blah. What's the negative impact of opting out? Less exposure. Okay, so more exposure if you put it in, less exposure if you opt out. What is it? What are we doing? It's a reduction in exposure. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. This basically says, irrespective of what the seller's wishes are, If the broker, the example I just gave you said, I already have a buyer for the property and I'm gonna sell the property immediately. But if I don't have a buyer for the property and I put a for sale sign, I hold an open house, I put a post on Facebook, I do anything that can be deemed marketing of the property, then I have to put it in the MLS, okay? I have to, because that's the rule. So, so if I do any of those marketing activities, it's got to go into the MLS one way or the other. And then you'll hear about this clear cooperation policy. And our MLS, by the way, has adopted the clear cooperation policy, which in effect says what I just said. If you do 1 day of marketing, it's got to get into the MLS. Actually, forget about 1 day. If you do anything within marketing, it needs to get into the MLS within 1 business day thereafter. Okay. For those of you like, wait, no, doesn't this have something to do with those lawsuits out there? I hear about these lawsuits and the clear cooperation policy. Yes, it absolutely has something to do with the lawsuits they are partially involved in this. And frankly, there's other lawsuits going on out there by brokers and other MLSs that are suing to make this the standard. A lot of businesses ran their model this way. So the long and the short of it is the seller says, hey, I understand what I'm doing. You're not going to put my property in the MLS. And more than likely what that means is you're going to sell my property. You're going to represent the buyer. And I get that. Okay. So if you can check all the boxes that make sense, then you're going to use this form. Otherwise, stay away from it like the plague. I hate it. Information request. This is again seldom used. This is one of those, hey, where do I park my car? You know, generally, I think the title of this up here talks about HOA. That's actually the wrong title. This doesn't have to be an HOA, but generally speaking, I'm going to use this in an HOA. Where do I park my car? Do I get a storage space? Do I get a parking space? Do I get a garage? So this would be a form that you would disclose to the parties that says this is where my parking is. I think that's pretty straightforward. I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time on that. We're getting close, guys. We're getting close. Buyer inspection waiver. Again, I know the title's wrong. Let's see if they got the waiver in here for you. So, okay, great. Again, I don't like this form, but if they are going to waive some stuff, then this is a great form to use. So the inspection waiver basically says exactly what it says. First of all, it says, in effect, paragraph 1 says, don't waive it. They're important. You want to get these inspections. But if you do that, you're going to have some rights and you're going to waive those rights. Home inspections, wood destroying pests, whatever it happens to be, they go through and they can come there and say, I'm not going to do this. I think I told you guys this story last week. Since we're going to get out a little early today, we're probably going to get sued. This was a transaction that oh my gosh, I'm drawing blank. Anyway, it'll come to me. She called me the day before close of escrow and said, hey, there's one septic inspection done on the property. It won't full-blown certify the septic. I will only say it'll work for a year because there's other problems. They said, we're going to get another inspection. The buyer said, well, I want to close escrow immediately. I don't want to wait, because they were going to have to wait through the weekend for the second inspection. So in writing, not on this form, but in writing, the buyer said, go ahead and close it. I'm going to waive the second inspection. They close escrow. The same day escrow closed. It closed on a Friday. The inspection was done. The report was done that evening. It was emailed over that evening. And the following, over the weekend, the buyer now looks at it and says, oh my gosh, I should have waited. I have $40,000 worth of septic repairs that need to be done. Now, they waived that. We were the listing agent, by the way. We have emails from the buyer's agent that said they waived it, but we don't have this form. And I would like to have this form. This would have been a good form to have, to basically have, additional waiver from the buyers in that regard. BMI, did we get this one loaded in here? We did. Okay. Material issues. Okay. So again, sellers have an obligation to this. And by the way, I went deep into Norm's documents and said, what am I missing? What documents do I have that Norm put in his class that I missed? This was one of them. I would not have included this in here, but I'm channeling Norm right now. So what do we have here? As you can tell, this is not a new form. This reform has not been revised in 12 years. I got to tell you, I don't think I've ever seen this form used, so I'm not going to spend a whole hell of a lot of time on it, but it's an interesting one. So the parties, John is the buyer, Sally is entered into agreement with Coldwell Banker. acquiring the property. If known, the buyer is made or is contemplating making an offer on 123 Main Street, blah, 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 blah. In accordance with the terms and conditions of the oral, or the written or oral agreement, buyers agrees to notify the broker in writing of any material issues to the buyer. Okay, so what is the buyer concerned about? What's important to the buyer? Okay, so buyer could sit back. I'll give you an example. If the buyer is concerned that they do not want to buy a house that's close to a registered sex offender. That's a material issue. Okay, so if that was the case, we would sit back and say, okay, that's very understandable. Maybe you've had a bad experience in your family or a child or something like that, but this is the deal. We understand that's what's important to you. However, that is something that you're going to have to verify, because we don't verify that. Another one, I use this example a lot because this is a true story. It was very material to the buyer that they were able to build a tennis court or a swimming pool on the lower part of the property or in any part of the property. I don't want to buy the house unless I can do that. Okay, great. You need to verify that this particular property will allow you to build a tennis court or a swimming pool on the property. So that's the type of stuff that we're referring to here. This is a super duper loss mitigation type form. I got to tell you, I've been doing SkySlope now for well over a year. Because I was doing for the better part of last year when Norm wasn't feeling well. I've never seen this form used. I don't think I've ever seen this form used, period. So, but that's the type of thing that you would use this form for. And then again, it's got our scope of duties. It says, hey, guess what? We don't check Megan's Law, and we don't do check for pools and all the rest of that. So that would be a type of area where you would use this form. This is another buyer investigation election, similar to the waiver. This one's actually a little bit better. Same exact language, except the other one was very specific to termite and this and that and the other one. This one basically gives you everything under the sun. Okay, so I've got, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do. Here's that septic inspection. Boom, I don't need it. Not going to get it. This one I do see a lot. To be honest with you, I don't like seeing it. But if they're going to waive it, use this form. And I actually prefer this form as opposed to the other form, because the other form is very limited. I think the other form needs to go away, and we need to be using, and this one is what's the form number on this? This is the BIE, as opposed to the BIW, Buyer's Investigation Waiver. This one, in fact, it's kind of the reverse of the waiver. So it's got all of these inspections listed. And then in fact, you come in here and you can say, well, what's the language? The buyer represents independently approved. Buyer makes, if the buyer does not investigate any of these during the contractual investigation, buyer may lose their right. So they're going to go through and check what they're going to do, check what they're not going to do. Okay, guys, we're getting really, really close here. Again, we got to clean this up. Did we get this form? Okay, we did not. Oh, we did. We went through this last week or the week before. So this is another one. This is one I'm normally going to include in a short sale section, which, by the way, we're probably going to end up with more than 6 or 7 sections here. I am going to pull out a completely separate section that has to do with foreclosures and short sales, because we're probably going to have a couple of short sales and maybe 1 or 2 foreclosures here and there. So we're going to lump those together. This would be a form that you would use on a short sale. This would also be a form that you would use within a homeowners association. And we already covered it. So let's skip past this. And what else do we have? The BEO. Let's see how far we got. Buyers, I hate this form. If you guys are using this form, you probably need to talk to me, Drew, Drake, Paul, Norm, somebody, and say, hey, I'm about ready to use this buyer early occupancy addendum. What do you think? And I'm going to tell you, don't do it. As a general rule, I don't care if it's my mother and she wants to take 1/2 of 1/4 of 1 foot of the garage to put some furniture in prior to close of escrow. I'm going to say that's a horrible idea. Okay. Giving the buyer early occupancy, it might sound like you're solving a problem at the time because everybody's putting a lot of pressure on you. I'm telling you, you're asking for nothing but trouble. If you were to do it, this would be the form that you would use. And again, it's intended for short term, 29 days or less. God forbid you're going to give the seller or the buyer early occupancy of 2 days, yet alone 29 days or longer. Ugh, it's horrible. By the way, if it's more than 29 days, you're going to use the interim occupancy agreement. very similar to the seller has the SIP, seller in possession, or the RLAS. It's the exact same thing, only it's in reverse. Now you're giving a buyer occupancy to a house they don't own. I think for all the obvious reasons, that's bad news. But if you did do it, they're granted possession for how many calendar days? And in effect, this is not, by the way, a lease agreement. This is a license for the buyer to use this property. In theory, it makes them easier to evict, in theory. But that old rule, possession's 9/10 of the law, possession's 9/10 of the law. Generally, they have to pay for that. So what are they going to pay for? They're going to pay $100 a day, $200 a day, something. If you do this, my recommendation is the buyer needs to have all their money into escrow, all their loan docs need to be signed, all of their down payment money needs to be in. And I think they need to pay a huge dollar amount. So if a reasonable rental rate would be $100 a day, I think they should pay $500 a day. These are all those type of things that need to be discussed. Is there a deposit? All of these things get really funky. Who pays for the utilities? Well, it says the buyer's agreeing to pay for the utilities, but really, what if it's only going to be 5 days? Are we getting that turned? I don't know. What if the seller wants to come in and inspect the property while the buyer's still there? Can they do that? Well, they sure can. What if there's a maintenance problem? Oh my goodness. Oh my God. What if they assign it or sublet it? Well, they're not allowed to assign it or sublet it. We're now dealing with a whole nother set of problems that you just don't want to get yourself into if you can avoid. Whose insurance covers this property? Is it automatic that the seller's insurance is going to cover it because escrow hasn't closed, right? You now have a buyer who doesn't own the property, who's also technically not a tenant, but needs to have tenant insurance. But you also have a seller who owns the property, who doesn't at that point in time have renter's insurance as a landlord. So if you're going to do that, then we need to get all of those insurance items need to get covered. In this bottom sentence here is super, super important. Seller is advised not to let the buyer commence early occupancy, and the seller has both received a copy of the buyer's insurance and consulted with the seller's insurance. The seller's general homeowner insurance does not cover a buyer's interim occupancy. It's just bad news all the way around. Other terms and conditions, we could write some additional stuff in here if we needed to. Buyer signs, seller signs, and away you go. Stay away, guys. Stay away. Option to purchase. I'm going to take this part out and I'm going to put it into the addendum section, but this would basically be an option. I think it's pretty straightforward. Although there's nothing straightforward about an option. So this is entitled to be used with the purchase agreement. I apologize for the noise, guys. I'm literally at a truck stop and there's a truck pulled in, so this would be an option. Okay. If you're using a contract with an option to buy or an option agreement, all I can tell you with this is anything you can come up with, anything in your imagination. Drake, do me a favor, close this window for me. Anything that you can come up with in your imagination can fit into an option to buy agreement. Okay. It's just that simple. So, anything. So the more creative you get, probably the more dangerous it is, but anything the buyer and seller can come up with. So what this would be is, generally speaking, there's a lease. I'm going to lease the property for a year. I'm going to and if I want to buy it, I'm going to come up with a purchase agreement. We agree to purchase it for, $700,000, totally separate 16-page purchase agreement. And then you would use this option form to go with it. So let's go through it real quick. What's the date? California. Who's the optionor? Who's the optionee? The optionor is the seller. The optionee is the buyer/tenant. Property address. This would be an option to the purchase agreement. A lot of people think it's an option to the lease. It could be an option to the lease, but it generally be an option to the purchase agreement. And what do we have? Separate consideration. If I have an option, I have to pay for it. Okay. If you don't have consideration, you don't have an option. So what am I going to pay? 10 grand. Okay. So in order for me to have the option to purchase this property 12 months from now, I agree to pay you $10,000 today, $5,000 today, $200 today, $30,000 today. What's reasonable? I don't know. Depends on what you're selling. Okay. Generally speaking, the option is paid in advance. If they don't pay for it, why give them an option? All right. So what else do we have? Or mutually execution of the attached lease. You could have say, well, my option is I'm going to lease the property. But if you're gonna lease the property, generally speaking, which generally you are, you're gonna pay a higher lease amount. So here I gave you an example of I'm gonna pay $10,000 or $20,000 for the right to exercise my option. Well, suppose I'm not gonna spend that much. Well, that's crazy. I don't have that much money. Okay, well, how much are we gonna lease this for? It's a $3,500 a month rental. Cool. You're gonna pay me $5,000 a month for the rental. Why so much? Well, because $1,500 of that rent is going to be option money. Okay. And which, if the option's not exercised, that money goes away. So in this example, if they pay $10,000 or $20,000 and they did not exercise the option, seller gets to keep the money. In the lower example, item B, and you could do both A or B, it could be both. But let's suppose they pay an extra $1,500 in more rent than they normally would market rent, and they don't exercise the option. Who gets to keep the $1,500 a month? The owner of the property. Okay, pretty straightforward. If there is a lease, you would attach the lease. It would be dated, and all those terms and conditions would apply. How long is the option for? I don't know, 12 months is generally reasonable. I have 12 months. I'm going to give you $10,000, and anytime between now and 12 months from now at 11:59 p.m., I can exercise my option to buy the property for $800,000. Okay, not unusual. Any of those terms could apply. Manner to exercise. Option E may exercise the option only by delivering written unconditional notice of exercise. So I have to say, I'm doing this. This is what I'm doing. And it can't be conditional. You can't add extra conditions. Oh, I'll buy it, but now you got to paint the house. Or I'll buy it, but now you got to pay $5,000 of my closing costs. Nope. It's got to be non-conditional. What's ever in the original offer is what has to apply. Non-exercise, basically option. They say, I don't want it. I decided not to buy the house. If they don't exercise the manner, then the option period written or terminate, then what happens? Basically, we can go through this. Their money's gone. All option consideration paid. That's my $10,000 example. Rent paid, the extra $1,500. Any services. Hey, the optioner cleaned the pool and they cut the grass and they painted the fence. All gone. All of that basically is retained by the optioner, the owner of the property. Okay. Can that change? Yes. All of that can change. You can go crazy. You can modify. Oh, the optionee gets half of it back or some of it back, or it gets applied towards a down payment. Sky's the limit. Whatever you want to do, I would suggest try to be less creative. Effect on default on the option. Option shall have the right not to exercise the option if the optionee is not performed enough, and they're not. So basically, they're not obligated to do that. There's no obligation by the optionee to do this. They don't have to. Pretty straightforward stuff. Optional disclosure. Okay, there's rules 1 to 4. Okay, 1 to 4 are residential. So unless exempt, if the property contains 1 to 4, the optioner shall provide the optionee the TDS. 1 to 4 units, all of the residential rules apply. So they have to get the TDS, they got to get the NHD, they got to give them the SBQs, all of those lovely things that they would do on any regular sale. That needs to be given over. Purchase agreement. This just talks about the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement. I don't know that we need to go through that. Dispute. If there's a dispute, they go to mediation arbitration. They don't sue each other first. This is one of those lovely things. What happens if the property is damaged? What if the optioner damages the property? Well, the optioner responsible to fix it? Yes. Well, what if the optionee was releasing the property and then they damage the property? Well, whoever damaged it potentially is going to be responsible, not potentially, will be responsible to make it whole. Okay. Optionee inspection. This would apply where the optionee is not leasing the property. Okay. Or maybe they are leasing the property. Hey, have I inspected it? Sure. No, I haven't. Okay. Well, now I have the right to do inspections. Okay. So do you think that might be important? You have an option. They exercise their option, but they haven't inspected the property. Well, potentially they could be putting all that option money at risk. And then they got to go get it back. They never did an inspection. They didn't realize it has a bad septic or whatever it happens to be. Recording. You can record these things, guys. You don't have to record just deed of trusts and grant deeds. You can record an option. Every option should be recorded. There is a situation going on right now in our office where there is some legal discussions about an option and is that option valid? And was it done properly, or was there some mischief going on? Well, if I was the optionee, it would have been nice to have that option recorded. In this particular example, the option was not recorded, would have given the optionee much more protection. People would not be coming back looking at this person saying, who did this? And we're suspect that this option is actually valid because the option, or in this case, it passed away. But the option was never recorded. It's always a good idea if you're going to do these to get the option recorded, so it's recorded. It's stamped and dated and more official. Other terms and conditions, again, you can get it creative as you want. Standard attorney fees. How do we get compensated? Sky's the limit. How do you want to get compensated? A percentage of this upfront fee, whatever you guys can come up with. Again, try not to be too creative, but there's no limitations on this. Standard time is of the essence contract. If it says to do it in 12 months, you better exercise your option in 12 months, not 12 months in a day. Seller may not want to sell the property to you anymore. Terms and conditions, whatever's in the offer applies. Straightforward stuff. Then we've got signature page, and that is it. And I thought, by the way, you could counter this. So they could have an option, the optioner could counter it and say, okay, no, we're not going to give you 12 months. We're going to give you 6 months. And you could go back and forth, just like you would be countering a regular offer, because really that's what this is. And this is an offer. Okay, agents sign off on this and we're done with the option. And that is it, guys. I'm going to pause for questions for a minute. A few of you guys came in a little bit late, so let me tell you what to expect for the materials we have right now. I told you guys that this slide is on the front and at the end of every one of these. So this is going to be the reference materials for you guys moving forward. If you do not intend on re-attending Contract College next week, and the reality is most of you, I mean, I'm looking for an audience, but most of you, you don't need to be in Contract College every Thursday of the year. Get into Contract College once a year. So I'm going to give you guys a graduation so that you can come back later. But this is my plan moving forward. You'll be able to come here, click on this. You'll have access to this 24/7. This is the same link that we use. It's on the regular link tree as well. You'll be able to come into contract anytime you want. All of the presentations we just went through are here. I am going to modify them. I'm going to tweak them. I'm going to clean them up. I'm going to put things in a little bit different order, and they're going to get prettier and better and better and better. And then you'll be able to come here. And then in addition to, for example, coming and looking at the contract performance section, in addition to having all of the slides that we've gone through with all of the notes, it will also have a PDF with all of the forms in the proper order, so you can reference those as well. So everything will be lined up perfectly and beautiful. And this is frankly something Norm and I've been talking about for 10 years, and I think we're finally going to get there. So at any rate, I probably did miss a form. So if you guys are like, Lance, wait a minute, I don't think you covered the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's entirely possible. We'll add that into next month's Contract College. It'll go into the appropriate section, and it will be there, and it'll be memorialized for you guys to reference at a later date. So I think I'm done. Anybody have any questions, comments, anything before we get out of here? On a personal note, did any of you guys watch the Starship launch this morning? Was it amazing? In case you guys didn't figure this out, Drake and I, we're currently in Texas. We saw that thing launch live from the beach this morning. Absolutely insane. Just absolutely crazy stuff. So anybody wants to geek out with me on that, we can talk about it at a later time, but it was very, very cool. Very, very cool. I'm a big Elon Musk and a SpaceX fan. So, okay, guys, I don't see anybody unmuted, and I don't see anything in chat. So I'm going to call it a day. And I don't want to discourage you. So there are a couple of, without calling you out by name, there are a couple of you guys who should be in next Thursday's Contract College. Frankly, and if you have any doubt whether you should be, you probably should be. Continue to get value with that. So, okay, guys, have a wonderful day, and we will see you next time. Take care. Bye.